Welcome back everyone to more NASCAR Heat 3 coverage here at Knee Pit Gaming. Today's setup video takes us to Indianapolis for the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. We'll be taking a look at setups, lap times, a little discussion about the track itself, and driving styles in both the Xfinity and the Monster Energy Cup cars. No trucks at this particular track, so we'll only be talking about two of the major series, so let's get to it. All right, now that we're here at the track, before we get into the setup discussion, let's start off by talking a little bit about the track itself and some lap times and the AI and that sort of stuff. I do use the same setup between Xfinity and Cup. That's why we're already in the Cup car, so keep that in mind. There's also some very quick and easy adjustments that I can make between Xfinity and Cup and really change the handling of the car to make it even more stable or to make it rotate better, and they're very quick and simple adjustments. We'll talk about those in just a little bit, but let's get to the track itself. You will spend a tremendous amount of time, in fact, nearly 100% of the time at full throttle. You can almost run this track wide open with no more time than I spent here. It was unfortunate that the AI are no better than they are at this track, because once I get to where I can outrun the AI easily, it's no longer fun to try to find more speed, so I stopped. So the lap times that we're going to talk about here in just a moment certainly are not the quickest lap times that even I could run, much less the quickest laps that I can envision others running. So the AI here are a little bit better in Cup than Xfinity, but not a whole lot. A little bit more racy in Cup, but still, in both of these classes, you're going to find yourself easily outrunning the AI. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about lap times themselves. In the Xfinity car, my quicker laps are around a 49 flat, 49.1, and that's going to be miles ahead, anywhere from a half second or more per lap ahead of the AI, even in qualifying trim. So it's going to be even more than that in race trim. So you're easily going to be either on the pole or probably in the top 2 or 3. If you're anywhere near a 49.1 or 2, you're going to be easily on the front row. Then we move on to the Cup cars, and my quicker laps here are in the 47.5, 47.6 range. But once again, you're not going to need to be anywhere near that in order to have good race pace against the AI. I think the quickest AI qualified here on maximum difficulty somewhere around a 47.7. So that gives you an idea of where you would need to be at the front of the pack for that. And then of course, they're going to be slower than that in the race. So you'll have absolutely no trouble easily outrunning them during the race. Now, as far as the setup itself, you notice that the shock setting, normally I've been using the 3.5 setup between bump and rebound. This time I just wanted to change it up because I got a little bored with it. So I wanted to go a little bit higher, a little bit closer to what I had used in NASCAR Heat 2, which was 10s across the board on the shock. So here we're doing a 10-13 setup, but as I mentioned in all the videos, there are any number of things you can do with the shocks to make the car and really change the car's handling to make it to your liking by simply going into each individual corner of the car and adjusting the shocks there. So plenty of adjustability there, but the 10-13 that I started with worked perfectly fine. And again, I didn't have any need to find any more speed than we already had by the first settings that I threw at this particular car. So moving on to the weight settings, we want maximum left side weight, and then the front weight and wedge I really use for my purposes to control the amount of rotation and the timing of that rotation. The more front weight you use, the more stable the car will be, particularly on corner entry. So it helps to tighten up the car with increased front weight. And if you want to, of course, do the opposite and make the car looser on entry, then lowering that front weight will certainly help you with that as well. The wedge at 52%, I wanted to use a little bit lower number, but for stability purposes, 52 worked fine. But just so you know, I tested at lower than 52 and was perfectly fine. It simply frees the car up, particularly on entry, and allows you to be very aggressive with the throttle. As I mentioned earlier, you can run this track nearly 100% flat out. So anything you can do to help the rotation of the car without getting it too loose and starting to slide the back end will help you gain speed. So adjust that wedge, increase it if you need a little bit more stability, the car is over rotating on entry, or decrease it if you want the car to rotate a little bit more on entry. But again, this particular setting seemed to be very stable while still having plenty of speed to outrun the AI. Moving on to the spring settings, 1,000 pounds on the left front and 1,200 pounds on the right front. I wanted the left front here to be a little bit less than the right front, simply for stability on corner entry. If you want the car to be a little bit looser on corner entry, simply increase that left front spring and see if that works for you as well or better than either adjusting front weight or wedge, or what we'll talk, and some other things we'll talk about here momentarily. Moving to the rear of the car, this is one of the easy options to adjust the car and how much rotation it has overall, not just on entry, but overall throughout the corner, and particularly on corner exit. So 350 pounds in the left rear, 550 pounds in the right rear. I have tried using the maximum of 400, 600 while keeping the same rear spring split, and it worked perfectly fine. But again, for the release version of this setup, I decided to back off just a little bit for stability of the car, since speed is not going to be an issue here against the AI. So 350 and 550, 200 pounds of rear spring split worked good. Now, if you want to increase that, increase both of the rear springs together, then that will help the rear of the car to rotate even more, particularly on corner exit and through the center. So keep that in mind. And if the car is a little bit tail happy for you and you really don't want to mess with the wedge or the front weight, then simply lower the rear springs to something like, say, 300 and 500 or even lower, and that will certainly tighten up the car for you. So the very easy and quick adjustment that you can make to tighten or loosen the car there in just the rear springs. Moving on to the tire settings, there's, as always, a lot of things you can do with the tire pressure, but again, didn't need any more speed. So what I started out with, which is 25 to 27 pounds on the left side and anywhere from 30 to about 33 pounds on the right side, seemed to work perfectly fine. And then you can adjust from there based on whether you want to tighten or loosen the car. And then moving on to the miscellaneous settings, maximum front camber, simply because it works. For those of you who are worried about that not being a realistic number, keep in mind, you're playing a game, and all games have things that work very differently than real life. So keep that in mind. Front sway bar is at 1.15 inches, but just going back to the camber for just a moment. You can run a lot less camber here and be perfectly fine. The car just won't turn as much. You won't have as much grip because this game allows more camber equals more grip. And normally that's the case up to a point, but not here. You get more grip all the way up through the maximum camber. So back off of that if you want the car to be a little bit more stable and a little bit tighter for you. Then adjusting the camber down to something like maybe +5, -5, or even lower will certainly make the car tighter and more stable for you. The 1.15 inches on the front sway bar is pretty standard for me, and I didn't really see any reason to adjust it here at this track either. The track bar is at 12 inches on both the left and the right side, and this is another one of those easy ways to very quickly adjust the handling of the car. Increasing this track bar will make the rear of the car more pronounced whenever you're steering, make the car looser overall. And then if you are feeling too loose, then an easy adjustment is to simply lower the track bar on both sides down to 11 or even 10 and see if that helps you out. So between the rear springs, the track bar, and the wedge, you have three very easy ways of adjusting the handling of the car in very profound ways. Because remember, the more aggressive you are on the throttle, the looser you're going to need the car to be in order to maintain the maximum amount of speed. So you can adjust all that with those three things we just talked about. Brake bias for me, I don't need to use the brakes at this track, but anywhere from 70 to 75% here, if I find myself in lap traffic, will certainly do the trick and keep the car stable enough so that I don't have to worry about getting too loose or too tight under heavy braking, again, if I'm in traffic. Grill tape, All you really need to worry about is don't get it overheating. 35% I think was just fine, and you can get more aggressive than that, I'm sure. But all I cared about was that I wasn't overheating the car, and that was it. Because unfortunately the grill tape doesn't do what it's supposed to do in this game. Wheel lock is at 10 degrees, which is pretty standard for me on the asphalt tracks. If you want the wheel to respond quicker to your inputs, then increase this number up to 12, 15, and so on, and that will certainly have quicker steering for you. And then the opposite is also true. If you want to make the steering slower, then drop it down to 9, 8, or so on. Moving on finally to the gear settings, this is another place where you have a lot of adjustability and can really adjust how tight or loose the car is with the rear end gear. Now the first through fourth gears I don't generally mess around with a whole lot because they seem to work just fine, even with very little if any tweaking to them. The rear end ratio is where I really spend any time I'm going to spend on gearing. 325 works really good here. You can also increase that by a step or two or decrease it by a step or two. If you increase it by a step or two, that meaning that you're going to run something like a 333 or a 340 gear, then that's going to turn more RPMs and generally going to make the car looser when you're on the throttle. If you drop the rear end ratio to something like maybe a 310 or a 3.0 gear, then that's going to lower the number of RPMs you're running and generally tighten the car up when you're under heavy throttle. So hopefully that will help you guys out a little bit at Indianapolis. Hopefully you can use some of these settings in setting up your own car for Indy. Thank you very much for joining me, and stay tuned as we will continue our support for NASCAR Heat 3.